Today's question comes from a group of Year 11 students at Oakmoor School. They ask, even with complete power, could prejudice and discrimination be ended? And are there any situations where prejudice is beneficial? Now, to answer these questions, we first need to begin by defining what it is that we mean by prejudice. When I want to think about prejudice and discrimination in society, the philosopher who I often turn to is Miranda. Now, Fricker defines prejudice in terms of epistemic dysfunctions. Now, an epistemic dysfunction is something that goes wrong with the way that we know the world. Epistemology is the part of philosophy that's interested in questions of knowledge and truth. And so when something is going wrong with the way that we know things, that's an epistemic dysfunction. Now, what makes prejudice a particular kind of epistemic dysfunction is that it is a set of ideas or attitudes that we have towards a particular social group that are resistant to counter evidence. So that means that they aren't things that we think about the world or about particular groups of people that are easily disrupted or overturned. To give you an example, there is a stereotype which I've encountered a number of times here in the UK, which is that Americans are more into the holiday Thanksgiving than they are into Christmas. So people say, oh, Thanksgiving, it's a big deal. People are much more likely to go home, and it's like a lot more important than Christmas. This is not true. Not all Americans celebrate Christmas, obviously, but in terms of the kind of cultural impact of a holiday, Christmas is definitely more important to the culture as a whole than Thanksgiving. So that's a pretty easily disrupted stereotype. Someone says, oh, you're really into Thanksgiving. Are you going home for Thanksgiving this year? And I say, no, I'm not. I'm going home for Christmas because Christmas is a bigger holiday. And then that person thinks, I had a stereotype that wasn't accurate, and I have now changed my mind. A prejudice is something which goes deeper. It's resistant to that kind of counter evidence. So even if you have experiences or you read things or you encounter new information that should make you change the ideas that you have about a particular social group, a prejudice means that you're particularly resistant to counter evidence. Now let's go back to our questions from the students at Oakmoor School, and we'll start with that second question first. Are there any situations where prejudice is beneficial? Now, I think when we're asking questions like, is something beneficial or something good, it's always wise to start by asking, beneficial for whom? So if the prejudice is an idea that we have about a particular social group which is resistant to counter evidence, those prejudices might shape the way that we evaluate or judge a particular person. So you can imagine in the situation of a job interview, if the person conducting the interview has a prejudice and there's two candidates, and one is me, a white man, and the other is a black woman. If the person conducting the interview has prejudices, which mean that he or she thinks that white men are somehow better or more equipped to do a job well than a black woman, then I will benefit from that prejudice. I will be more likely to get that job than the other candidate. Now, in that situation, obviously I am benefiting from the prejudice, but no one else in the situation is. The person who's the other candidate isn't benefiting. In fact, she's experiencing an injustice. She's being discriminated against. And the person who's doing the hiring isn't benefiting because they're getting someone who might not be the best person for the job. So when we're asking these questions about what is beneficial, we should always start off by asking beneficial for whom? This takes us back to our first question. Even with complete power, could prejudice and discrimination be ended? Now let's imagine that we have some sort of new supreme benevolent leader who decides that as one of their first acts, they want to end prejudice and discrimination. And there are a number of ways that they could go about doing that. Maybe they would pass laws making it illegal to discriminate against people. And to help combat prejudice, maybe they would change the things we learn at school. We could broaden our history curriculum and learn more about the accomplishments of civilizations in Africa and Asia and South America. We could expand what we study in philosophy, spend a little bit less time on the dead old white guys, and a little bit more time learning about Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy, for example. And all of those things, no doubt, would help combat prejudice and discrimination. but we know that we already have laws against discriminating in the workplace. And there are already lots of people working to use education as a space in which we can combat prejudice. So it seems like maybe we would have to do something more. And to understand this, I think it's useful to go back to our example of the job interview. Now, there's still a lot of sexism and racism and classism that happens in job interviews, but let's imagine that the person conducting the job interview is someone who sort of prides themselves on wanting to have an inclusive and diverse workplace. Now, there is still a chance that there are some prejudices that might motivate their behavior, but they might be prejudices that aren't sort of ideas that they're consciously holding about certain social groups. And to understand this phenomenon, I always turn to the work of Helen, who's written a book on the habits of racism. So No, in her book, explains that racist ideas aren't just things that sort of work at the level of the mental. They are part of our bodily existence. They're about feelings and emotions and instincts and a whole set of deeper ways of being in the world than just the ideas that we hold in our head. So when we talk about racist ideas, sometimes that language of ideas is a little bit misleading because it makes us think that primarily what prejudice and discrimination are about are ideas that operate at the level of the mental rather than something which is a more sort of whole body experience. And so if we wanted to combat racism at the level of habit or prejudice more generally at the level of habit, we would have to start to think what would be necessary to change the way that we experience the world. Part of that is probably who we interact with on a day-to-day basis. If you grow up in a predominantly white community, it might be harder to have a more inclusive and open-minded attitudes about other racial groups. Likewise, if we grow up in communities which still emphasize a strict division between the way that boys are supposed to do something and girls are supposed to do something, whether that be in terms of sports, and always dividing into two genders rather than being open to the possibility that other people might experience gender as more of a spectrum. All these ideas shape our experience from a very early age. And when we're talking about combating prejudice and discrimination, we can do things to combat at the level of ideas, and those things are good, and we should be doing those things. But when it comes down to this more embodied sense of prejudice and discrimination, I think the challenge is much more complex and long-term. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be committed to doing that work, just that it's a little bit more complicated than combating prejudice at the level of ideas.